The morning sun barely peeked through the thick clouds as Jerome Williams stood in front of his small bathroom mirror, carefully adjusting his only good tie. The navy blue fabric had seen better days, with a small stain near the bottom that he'd tried countless times to wash out. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was respectable. Today wasn't just any day. Today he had to go to court. Jerome worked the night shift at a local hospital, cleaning floors and emptying trash bins. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for him and his elderly mother. Every penny mattered in their household, so when that parking ticket arrived in the mail 3 weeks ago, his heart sank. $200. That was almost half of what he made in a week. The ticket felt especially unfair because Jerome knew exactly what had happened that day. He'd been helping Mrs. Rodriguez, his neighbor who lived 2 doors down. She was 83 years old and had just returned from the grocery store with bags too heavy for her to carry. Jerome had seen her struggling from his window and rushed outside to help. He'd only meant to be there for a few minutes, just long enough to get her groceries inside her apartment, but Mrs. Rodriguez had started crying that day. Her grandson, the only family she had left, had been deployed overseas. She was scared and lonely, and Jerome couldn't just walk away. He'd sat with her for nearly an hour, listening to her worries and making her a cup of tea. When he finally returned to his car, the bright orange ticket was tucked under his windshield wiper like a cruel joke. The parking meter had expired by just 10 minutes. 10 minutes of human kindness had cost him $200 he didn't have. Jerome had tried calling the court to explain, but the clerk had been unsympathetic. "Sir, you can contest the ticket in court if you want," she'd said in a bored voice. "But you'll need to take time off work, and there's no guarantee the judge will dismiss it." Taking time off work meant losing money he desperately needed, but paying the ticket meant going without groceries for a week. Jerome had prayed about it, tossed and turned for nights, and finally decided to fight it. Surely a judge would understand that sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences nobody should have to face. The courthouse was intimidating, built from gray stone with tall pillars. It looked like something from another century. Jerome had never been inside a courthouse before, except for jury duty once, and that had been in a different building. This place felt cold and unwelcoming. People in expensive suits walked briskly through the halls, their shoes clicking against the marble floors with confidence Jerome wished he could feel. He found courtroom 6B after asking for directions twice. The waiting area was filled with people who looked just as nervous as he felt. Some clutched papers in their hands, others stared at their phones, probably trying to distract themselves from the stress of whatever legal trouble had brought them here. When Jerome's name was finally called, his mouth went dry. The courtroom was bigger than he'd expected, with rows of wooden benches like church pews. But unlike church, this place didn't feel like sanctuary. The ceiling was high with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows. Everything was brown and beige, colors that seemed designed to make people feel small. Judge Harrison Whitmore sat behind an enormous wooden desk that looked more like a throne than furniture. He was a white man in his early 60s, with silver hair slicked back and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His black robe made him look even more imposing, like some ancient king passing judgment on his subjects. Jerome walked toward the front of the courtroom, his work boots squeaking slightly against the polished floor. He'd worn his best clothes, but standing in this formal space, he felt underdressed and out of place. The judge didn't even look up when Jerome reached the defendant's table. "State your name for the record," the court clerk said. "Jerome Williams, Your Honor," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Whitmore finally looked up, and Jerome immediately felt the weight of his gaze. The judge's eyes swept over Jerome's appearance, taking in his worn but clean shirt, his slightly scuffed shoes, and his nervous posture. Something shifted in the judge's expression, a slight hardening around his eyes. "Let me guess," Judge Whitmore said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "You have some elaborate story about why the parking laws don't apply to you?" Jerome felt heat rise in his cheeks. "No, sir. Yes, sir. I can explain what happened." "Oh, I'm sure you can," the judge replied, and a few people in the gallery actually chuckled. "They always can. Let me save us both some time, Mr. Williams. Did you or did you not park in a metered space?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And did you or did you not pay the required fee for the entire time your vehicle occupied that space?" Jerome's heart raced. "Well, no, sir, but there were circumstances." Circumstances, Judge Whitmore repeated the word like it tasted bad. There are always circumstances with people like you. Let me guess. Family emergency? Medical emergency? Some crisis that just happened to occur right when you needed to save a few quarters. The courtroom was completely silent now. Jerome could feel dozens of eyes on him, and his hands started to shake slightly. Your Honor, I was helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries. She's 83 years old and I'm sure she's a lovely woman, the judge interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But last I checked, being a good neighbor doesn't exempt anyone from following the law. Do you think the city should just ignore parking violations whenever someone claims they were doing a good deed? Jerome felt trapped. Every word he tried to speak seemed to make things worse. No, sir, I just thought... You thought you could ignore the rules and then come into my courtroom with a sob story, Judge Whitmore said, leaning forward slightly. Well, Mr. Williams, I've heard every excuse in the book. Financial hardship, family problems, acts of kindness. They all sound very noble, but they all end the same way. Someone who thinks the law doesn't apply to them. The judge's words hit Jerome like physical blows. He'd expected the process to be formal, maybe even stern, but this felt personal. This felt cruel. Your Honor. Jerome tried one more time, his voice stronger now despite his fear. I've never had a parking ticket before. I work every day. I pay my taxes. I try to help my neighbors when I can. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking for fairness. Judge Whitmore's expression darkened. Fairness? Mr. Williams, what's fair is that everyone follows the same rules. What's fair is that people take responsibility for their actions instead of making excuses. What's fair is that this court doesn't waste taxpayer money listening to stories about Good Samaritan acts every time someone can't be bothered to feed a parking meter. Jerome felt his hope crumbling. The judge had already made up his mind before hearing a single fact about the case. This wasn't about justice or fairness. This was about something else entirely. Something that made Jerome's stomach turn with a familiar bitter recognition. The fine stands, Judge Whitmore declared. In fact, for wasting this court's time with frivolous arguments, I'm doubling it. $400 to be paid within 30 days or you'll face additional penalties. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Jerome stood frozen at the defendant's table, the judge's words echoing in his head like a bad dream. $400. The number felt impossible, like someone had just told him he owed $4 million. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers scattered on the table, trying to gather them before anyone noticed how badly he was shaking. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Some people looked sympathetic. Others seemed entertained by the show they'd just witnessed. Jerome could feel their eyes on him as he fumbled with his paperwork, dropping his pen twice before finally managing to pick it up. Judge Whitmore had already moved on, calling the next case as if Jerome's life hadn't just been turned upside down. The next defendant approached the bench, and Jerome knew he needed to leave. He needed to get out of this place before he completely fell apart in front of all these strangers. But as Jerome took his first step toward the exit, something unexpected happened. The bailiff's phone rang. In the formal, quiet atmosphere of the courtroom, the sudden electronic chirping sounded almost violent. Everyone turned to look at Officer Martinez, the bailiff, who looked mortified that his phone had disturbed the proceedings. He quickly reached for it, clearly intending to silence it, but then he saw the caller ID and his expression changed completely. Jerome watched as the color drained from Officer Martinez's face. The bailiff stared at his phone screen for what felt like forever, then looked up at Judge Whitmore with an expression Jerome had never seen on anyone's face before. It was fear mixed with confusion and something that looked almost like panic. Your Honor, Officer Martinez said, his voice unusually loud in the quiet courtroom. I'm sorry, but I need to interrupt. There's a call for you. Judge Whitmore looked annoyed. Officer Martinez, you know better than to allow personal calls during court proceedings. Whatever it is can wait until we're in recess. Sir, the bailiff replied, walking quickly toward the judge's bench. It's not a personal call. The caller specifically asked for you by name, and when I told them you were in session, they said it was about Mr. Williams here, and that it was urgent. Every head in. The courtroom turned toward Jerome, who felt like he'd been struck by lightning. He had no idea who could possibly be calling about him. He didn't know anyone important enough to interrupt a court session. He barely knew anyone at all outside of his small circle of work colleagues and neighbors. Judge Whitmore's frown deepened. This is highly irregular, Officer Martinez. Who exactly is calling my courtroom? The bailiff leaned in close to the judge and whispered something that made Judge Whitmore's eyebrows shoot up. Jerome couldn't hear what was said, but he could see the judge's reaction clearly. The arrogant confidence that had been written all over his face just moments before flickered like a candle in the wind. "That's impossible," Judge Whitmore said, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. "Are you certain?" Officer Martinez nodded grimly and handed the judge his phone. "They're holding on line 1, Your Honor. They said they'll wait." The entire courtroom held its breath. Jerome found himself staring at Judge Whitmore, watching as the man who had just humiliated him seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. The judge's hands, which had been so steady when he'd doubled Jerome's fine, now shook slightly as he reached for the phone. "This is Judge Whitmore," he said into the phone, and his voice cracked slightly on his own name. Jerome couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could see its effect on the judge's face. Judge Whitmore's expression went through a series of changes that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so surreal. First confusion, then recognition, then what looked like genuine terror. "Yes, I understand," Judge Whitmore said into the phone. "Yes, he's here in my courtroom right now." There was a long pause. "I see, yes, of course. I had no idea. No, of course not. Yes, immediately." The judge's face had gone completely pale. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. Jerome watched, fascinated and confused, as the man who had seemed so powerful just minutes ago transformed into someone who looked like he might be sick. "Thank you for calling," Judge Whitmore said finally. "Yes, I understand completely." "Yes, sir, thank you." He handed the phone back to Officer Martinez with hands that were visibly shaking now. The bailiff took it and stepped back, but Jerome noticed that even Officer Martinez looked shaken by whatever he'd witnessed. The courtroom was so quiet that Jerome could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. Judge Whitmore sat behind his massive desk, staring down at the papers in front of him as if he'd never seen them before. His silver hair, which had been perfectly styled when the session began, now looked disheveled. He'd run his hand through it at some point during the phone call. "Mr. Williams," Judge Whitmore said finally, and his voice was completely different now. Gone was the condescending tone, the casual cruelty, the assumption of superiority. Now he just sounded tired and perhaps a little afraid. Jerome stepped forward uncertainly. "Yes, Your Honor? I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Judge Whitmore looked up from his papers, and Jerome was shocked to see that the man's eyes looked almost desperate. "Are you related to anyone in the legal profession?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. Jerome blinked in confusion. "Sir? Federal prosecutors, judges, attorneys, anyone who works in law enforcement or the justice system. Are you related to anyone like that?" Jerome thought about it. His family was small and most of them lived far away. His mother had 2 sisters, but one was a retired teacher, and the other worked in a bakery. His father had passed away when Jerome was young, and he'd never known much about his father's side of the family. But then something clicked in his memory. "Well, sir, my sister works in Washington, D.C. She's some kind of lawyer for the government. We don't talk much, but I think she prosecutes people who break federal laws." Judge Whitmore's face went even paler, if that was possible. "What's your sister's name, Mr. Williams?" "Dr. Angela Williams," Jerome replied. "She kept her maiden name even after she got married. She has some fancy degree and works on big cases from what I understand. Why do you ask?" The judge closed his eyes and took a deep breath that seemed to shake his entire body. When he opened them again, he looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a terrible, possibly career-ending mistake. "And your brother-in-law?" Judge Whitmore continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does he do?" Jerome shrugged. "He's in politics, I think. Some kind of congressman or representative. David Chen is his name. They got married a couple years ago, but like I said, we don't really keep in touch much. I've only met him once or twice at family gatherings." At the mention of Congressman Chen's name, Judge Whitmore actually slumped in his chair. Around the courtroom, Jerome could hear people whispering more urgently now. Some of them seemed to recognize the names he'd mentioned. Jerome still didn't understand what was happening, but he could see that something had shifted dramatically in the last few minutes. The man who had treated him like dirt was now looking at him with what could only be described as fear and regret. Judge Whitmore sat in silence for a long moment, probably trying to figure out how to handle a situation he clearly hadn't expected when he'd woken up that morning. The entire courtroom waited. everyone sensing that they were witnessing something unusual, something that didn't happen in regular court proceedings. Finally, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and attempted to regain some composure, though his voice still shook slightly when he spoke. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat several times, but his voice still came out weak and uncertain. The transformation was so complete that Jerome wondered if he was looking at the same person who had mocked him just minutes earlier. The confident, arrogant judge had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Williams," the judge began, then stopped and cleared his throat again. "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings here today." Jerome frowned. Misunderstandings? He'd been pretty clear about what happened, and the judge had been pretty clear about doubling his fine. He couldn't see what there was to misunderstand. Around the courtroom, people were leaning forward in their seats. The next case that had been called was still waiting, but everyone seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. The prosecutor assigned to traffic court looked as confused as Jerome felt. Even Officer Martinez kept glancing between the judge and Jerome with a bewildered expression. "Your Honor," Jerome said carefully, "I'm not sure what you mean." Judge Whitmore picked up the file with Jerome's case information and stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. His hands were still shaking slightly, making the papers rustle in the otherwise silent courtroom. "Your sister, Dr. Angela Williams," the judge said slowly. "She works for the Justice Department, doesn't she? Specifically, she's a federal prosecutor who handles corruption cases involving state and local officials." Jerome nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure about all the details. "I think so, sir. Like I said, we don't talk much. But yeah, she prosecutes people who abuse their power or take bribes or stuff like that." The judge winced visibly at the phrase "abuse their power." He set down Jerome's file and rubbed his temples as if fighting off a massive headache. "And Congressman Chen, your brother-in-law, he serves on the Judiciary Committee, doesn't he?" "I honestly don't know, Your Honor," Jerome replied truthfully. "I only met him a few times at family events. He seems nice enough, but we don't really talk about his work. I know he's involved in making laws and stuff, but that's about it." What Jerome didn't know, but what Judge Whitmore clearly did know, was that Congressman David Chen wasn't just any politician. He was one of the most respected members of the House Judiciary Committee, known for his work on judicial reform and ethics. More importantly, he'd been making headlines recently for pushing legislation that would create stricter oversight of state and local courts. Judge Whitmore also knew something else that Jerome didn't. Dr. Angela Williams wasn't just any federal prosecutor. She was the lead prosecutor in a major corruption investigation that had already brought down 2 state judges and was rumored to be expanding. Her reputation for thoroughness and integrity was legendary in legal circles. She was also being considered for a federal judgeship herself, which meant she had the ear of some very powerful people in Washington. The phone call that had interrupted the court session had been from someone Judge Whitmore never expected to hear from directly. The caller had identified himself as a clerk from the office of Chief Justice Roberts, explaining that they'd received a call from Congressman Chen about a concerning situation involving his brother-in-law in a local courtroom. The Chief Justice's office wanted to make sure that Mr. Jerome Williams was receiving fair treatment. Given the sensitive nature of the family's work in judicial oversight, Judge Whitmore realized with growing horror that his behavior toward Jerome had been witnessed by a courtroom full of people, some of whom were probably already texting or posting about what they'd seen. In today's world, videos of courtroom encounters could go viral in hours. The last thing he needed was footage of him treating a federal prosecutor's brother with obvious bias and contempt. "Mr. Williams," Judge Whitmore said, attempting to sound official but failing to hide the nervousness in his voice. "Upon further review of your case, I believe I may have been too hasty in my initial ruling." Jerome blinked in surprise. "Sir? The circumstances you described, helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries, that's exactly the kind of community service that our courts should recognize and appreciate." The judge's voice was getting stronger now, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. "Citizens who go out of their way to help others, especially vulnerable members of our community, should be commended, not penalized." The prosecutor handling traffic cases looked up from her notes with obvious confusion. She'd been doing this job for 3 years and had never seen Judge Whitmore reverse a ruling in the middle of a session. especially not for something as routine as a parking ticket. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, and Jerome could hear desperation creeping into his voice, I think it's important that this court acknowledge when we've been presented with insufficient information to make a proper ruling. The parking enforcement officer's report failed to note the humanitarian nature of your actions, which is a significant oversight. Jerome had read the parking enforcement officer's report. It was pretty standard, just noting the time, location, and expired meter. There was nothing unusual about it at all. Every parking ticket probably looked exactly the same. Your Honor, Jerome said hesitantly, I appreciate you reconsidering, but I don't think the parking officer did anything wrong. He couldn't have known why I was there. The judge's eyes widened slightly as if Jerome had just thrown him a lifeline he desperately needed. Exactly. That's exactly the point, Mr. Williams. The system failed you. When citizens are engaged in acts of community service, there should be protections in place to prevent them from being penalized for their good deeds. Around the courtroom, people were starting to murmur more loudly. Some looked confused. Others seemed to be catching on that something unusual was happening. A few people had their phones out, and Jerome wondered if they were recording what was turning into a very strange morning. Therefore, Judge Whitmore announced, his voice now carrying through the courtroom with forced authority, I am not only dismissing your parking citation completely, but I am also ordering the city to compensate you for the wages you lost by having to appear in court today. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. Officer Martinez looked like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jerome felt like he might be dreaming. I don't understand, Your Honor, Jerome said. You don't have to do all that. I just wanted the fine reduced or maybe dismissed because I really can't afford to pay it. Judge Whitmore was sweating heavily now, despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. Mr. Williams, this court has a responsibility to ensure that good citizens like yourself aren't punished for doing the right thing. Your actions that day exemplify the kind of community spirit that makes our city strong. Jerome couldn't help but notice that just 15 minutes earlier, this same judge had called his actions excuses and accused him of thinking the law didn't apply to him. The complete reversal was so dramatic that it felt almost surreal. Additionally, the judge continued, clearly trying to think of more ways to make amends, I want to commend you publicly for your service to the community. Citizens like you who work hard and help their neighbors are the backbone of our society. The same judge who had just mocked Jerome's sob story was now praising him for the exact same actions. Jerome felt like he'd stepped into some alternate reality, where up was down and black was white. Is there anything else this court can do for you today, Mr. Williams? Judge Whitmore asked, and the question sounded almost pleading. Jerome shook his head slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. No, sir. I just want to go home and get some sleep before my shift tonight. Of course, the judge said quickly. You work the night shift at the hospital, providing essential services to our community. This court should never have taken up so much of your valuable time. As Jerome gathered his papers once again, this time with the citation marked dismissed in large red letters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The judge's behavior had changed so completely and so suddenly that it felt like more than just a change of heart. But as he walked toward the courtroom exit, Jerome decided he didn't really care why it had happened. Sometimes good things occurred for reasons that didn't make sense, and maybe it was enough to just be grateful and move on. He had no idea that his sister and brother-in-law were already making phone calls that would change Judge Whitmore's life forever. Jerome had barely reached the courtroom doors when Judge Whitmore's voice boomed across the room once again. Mr. Williams, if you could please wait just one moment. Jerome turned around, wondering what else could possibly happen in what was already the strangest morning of his life. Judge Whitmore was standing behind his bench now, something Jerome had never seen a judge do in the middle of a session. The man looked agitated, almost frantic, as if he'd just remembered something crucial. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Whitmore announced to the entire courtroom, his voice carrying a nervous energy that made everyone pay attention. I believe it's important that we address what happened here today in a broader context. The prosecutor handling traffic cases looked at her watch, and then at the stack of cases still waiting to be heard. This was highly unusual. Judges didn't typically make speeches in the middle of routine sessions, especially not about individual parking tickets that had already been resolved. Jerome walked back toward the front of the courtroom, confused but curious. Around him, the gallery buzzed with whispered conversations. People were definitely recording now. He could see the little red lights on several phones pointed toward the judge's bench. Mr. Williams, Judge Whitmore continued, your case today has highlighted some important issues about how our justice system sometimes fails to account for the human element in legal proceedings. Jerome had no idea what the judge was talking about. His case had been pretty straightforward, or at least it had seemed that way to him. He'd gotten a parking ticket, he'd tried to contest it, and now it was dismissed. He wasn't sure what broader issues were involved. Judge Whitmore began pacing behind his bench, his black robes swishing as he moved back and forth. Too often, we in the judicial system become focused on the letter of the law while losing sight of its spirit. We forget that behind every case file is a real person with real circumstances. The judge's voice was getting louder, more theatrical, as if he was performing for an audience rather than conducting a normal court session. Jerome glanced around and noticed that even the court reporter looked surprised by what was happening. When Mr. Williams appeared before this court today, Judge Whitmore continued, he represented something that we don't see often enough. A working man who puts community service above his own convenience. A citizen who sees a neighbor in need and doesn't hesitate to help, even when it might cost him personally. Jerome felt increasingly uncomfortable as the judge continued to praise him. This was the same man who, less than half an hour ago, had accused him of making excuses and thinking the law didn't apply to him. The dramatic reversal felt forced and artificial, like someone reading from a script they didn't really believe. I want everyone in this courtroom to understand, the judge said, turning to address the gallery directly, that Mr. Williams is exactly the kind of citizen our community needs more of. He works a difficult job, caring for others during the night shift at our local hospital. He looks after his elderly mother. He helps his neighbors without being asked. Jerome frowned. He hadn't mentioned his mother or his job responsibilities during the brief time he'd been allowed to speak. How did Judge Whitmore know these details about his life? The answer came to him with a chill of realization. Someone had told the judge about him. Someone with enough power to make a sitting judge completely change his behavior in the middle of a court session. Someone who knew personal details about Jerome's life and circumstances. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore announced, his voice now carrying a tone of righteous indignation, I want to acknowledge that this court initially failed Mr. Williams. We allowed procedural thinking to override common sense. We let bureaucracy triumph over humanity. The prosecutor assigned to traffic court was now staring openly at Judge Whitmore with an expression of complete bewilderment. In 3 years of working in this courtroom, she'd never seen anything like this performance. That failure stops today, the judge declared dramatically. Not only is Mr. Williams' citation dismissed, but I am personally going to ensure that our parking enforcement procedures are reviewed to prevent good Samaritans from being penalized for their kindness. Jerome wanted to disappear. The judge was making him sound like some kind of hero for helping an elderly woman with her groceries, which was just basic human decency. More importantly, all this attention felt wrong somehow, like he was being used as a prop in some play he didn't understand. Mr. Williams, Judge Whitmore said, turning back to him with what appeared to be genuine emotion in his voice. I want to apologize personally for any distress this process may have caused you. Citizens like you should be celebrated, not questioned. The apology felt hollow to Jerome, not because he thought the judge was insincere, but because it was so clearly motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. Judge Whitmore wasn't sorry for treating him badly. He was sorry that treating him badly might have consequences. Your Honor, Jerome said quietly, I appreciate everything you've said, but I really just want to go home now. Judge Whitmore's expression became almost pleading. Of course. But before you go, I want to make sure you understand that this court is always here to serve citizens like you. If you ever need any assistance with legal matters, please don't hesitate to reach out to my office directly. Jerome nodded politely, though he couldn't imagine any circumstances under which he would voluntarily return to this courtroom. The whole experience had been surreal and exhausting, and he just wanted it to be over. As Jerome turned to leave again, Judge Whitmore called out one more time. Oh, and Mr. Williams, I hope you'll convey my regards to your family. Your sister and brother-in-law are doing important work in Washington. Our community is fortunate to have such dedicated public servants representing our interests. There it was, The real reason for the judge's sudden change in behavior? Jerome's sister and brother-in-law had somehow intervened, probably through channels Jerome didn't even know existed. The phone call that had interrupted the court session hadn't been random. It had been targeted and purposeful. Jerome felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. He was glad the fine had been dismissed, but he didn't like the idea that he'd only received fair treatment because of who his family members were. What about all the other people who came through this courtroom without powerful relatives to make phone calls on their behalf? I'll be sure to tell them, Jerome replied, though he had no intention of calling his sister to discuss what had happened. Their relationship was complicated enough without adding courthouse drama to the mix. Judge Whitmore seemed satisfied with that response. Excellent. And please let them know that this court has nothing but respect for the important work they're doing to ensure justice and fairness in our legal system. As Jerome finally left the courtroom, he could hear Judge Whitmore attempting to return to normal business, calling the next case with forced cheerfulness, but the damage was done. Everyone in that courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, and Jerome had no doubt that word would spread quickly through the courthouse and beyond. He walked through the marble hallways with his dismissed citation in hand, feeling like he'd just survived something rather than won something. The justice he'd received felt tainted by the circumstances that had made it possible. Jerome had no way of knowing that in a few hours, video footage of Judge Whitmore's dramatic performance would be posted online by multiple people who had been in the courtroom that morning. He also had no way of knowing that his sister and brother-in-law were already planning their next moves, or that Judge Whitmore's troubles were just beginning. All Jerome knew was that he was free to go home, and that sometimes the system worked in mysterious and uncomfortable ways. Jerome thought the courthouse drama was behind him when he walked out those heavy doors and into the afternoon sunlight. He drove home to his small apartment, heated up leftover soup for lunch, and tried to get some sleep before his night shift at the hospital. But while Jerome was resting, the world around him was beginning to buzz with activity he knew nothing about. 3 people in the courtroom that morning had recorded different parts of Judge Whitmore's extraordinary performance on their phones. By evening, all 3 videos had been posted on social media platforms with captions like, "Judge completely changes tune when he finds out who defendant really is, and you won't believe what happened in this courtroom today." The videos spread quickly because they told a story that people found both fascinating and disturbing. The contrast between Judge Whitmore's initial treatment of Jerome and his desperate attempts to make amends was stark and uncomfortable to watch. Comments poured in from viewers expressing outrage at the obvious bias and questioning how many other people had been treated unfairly in that same courtroom. Jerome didn't know about any of this until his phone started ringing during his dinner break at the hospital 3 days later. The caller ID showed his sister's number, which surprised him because Angela rarely called unless someone in the family was sick or dying. Jerome. Angela's voice was tight with controlled anger when he answered. "I need to ask you about something that happened in court this week." Jerome sighed. He'd been hoping to avoid this conversation. "How did you find out about that?" "Someone sent me a video, Jerome. A video of a judge treating you like garbage and then completely changing his behavior when he realized who you were related to. What the hell happened in that courtroom?" Jerome told her the whole story, from Mrs. Rodriguez's groceries to the mysterious phone call to Judge Whitmore's dramatic turnaround. As he talked, he could hear his sister getting more and more upset. "That phone call came from Chief Justice Roberts' office," Angela told him when he finished. "David made some calls after I told him what was happening. We wanted to make sure you were being treated fairly." "I figured it was something like that," Jerome said. "But Angela, I don't want to be involved in anything bigger than this. I just wanted the ticket dismissed so I could pay my bills." "It's too late for that," Angela replied grimly. "This isn't just about you anymore, Jerome. That judge's behavior is a perfect example of everything that's wrong with our justice system. People are being treated differently based on who they know or what they look like. And that's exactly the kind of corruption I spend my career fighting." Over the next few weeks, Jerome watched in amazement as his simple parking ticket case became a symbol for something much larger. Legal ethics professors used the courtroom videos as teaching tools to show their students how judicial bias could manifest. Civil rights organizations pointed to Judge Whitmore's behavior as evidence of systemic problems in local courts. The State Judicial Conduct Board launched an investigation into Judge Whitmore's courtroom practices, They reviewed hundreds of cases and found troubling patterns in how he treated different types of defendants. People who came to court in expensive suits and spoke with confident voices received consideration and understanding. People who looked like Jerome received skepticism and harsh treatment. Jerome found himself reluctantly pulled into the spotlight when reporters started calling for interviews. He didn't want to be the face of judicial reform, but Angela convinced him that his story could help other people who didn't have powerful relatives to make phone calls on their behalf. Every time you tell this story, she explained during one of their phone conversations, you're speaking for all the people who got treated badly in that courtroom and had no way to fight back. Judge Whitmore tried to weather the storm at first. He issued public statements about his commitment to fairness and equal justice. He claimed that the videos didn't tell the whole story and that his decision to dismiss Jerome's citation had been based purely on the merits of the case, but more videos emerged. As people dug through social media posts from the past several months, someone found footage of Judge Whitmore berating a young mother for bringing her baby to court during a child support hearing. Another video showed him dismissing a college student's request for a payment plan on a speeding ticket with obvious contempt. The pattern was clear and damning. Judge Whitmore had been using his position to humiliate and punish people he saw as beneath him, while showing deference to anyone he perceived as having power or status. 6 months after Jerome's court appearance, Judge Whitmore announced his resignation. He claimed it was for personal reasons and to spend more time with his family, but everyone knew the real reason. The State Bar Association was preparing to file formal ethics charges against him, and he was facing the possibility of being removed from the bench in disgrace. Jerome followed the news with mixed feelings. He was glad that Judge Whitmore would no longer be in a position to treat people unfairly, but he felt sorry for the man's family, who hadn't done anything wrong but were suffering because of his actions. The most unexpected development came when Jerome received a letter from the local NAACP chapter asking if he would consider joining their legal advocacy committee. They wanted him to help other people navigate the court system and to speak at community meetings about his experience. I don't know anything about legal advocacy, Jerome told Angela, when she called to congratulate him on the offer. You know what it feels like to be powerless in that courtroom, she replied. You know what it's like to be treated unfairly by someone who's supposed to protect your rights. That's more valuable than any law degree when it comes to helping people who are going through the same thing. Jerome thought about it for several days before accepting. He kept his job at the hospital because he needed the steady income, but he started volunteering 2 evenings a week to help people prepare for court appearances and understand their rights. The work was harder than he'd expected, but also more rewarding. He met people who were struggling with legal problems they didn't understand, facing judges who seemed to have already made up their minds before hearing any evidence. Jerome couldn't make phone calls to powerful people on their behalf, but he could sit with them, help them organize their paperwork, and explain what to expect in the courtroom. A year after his own court appearance, Jerome was invited to speak at a law school symposium on judicial bias. As he stood at the podium looking out at an audience of future lawyers and judges, he thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who had moved in with her daughter in another state but still sent him Christmas cards. The scariest thing about what happened to me, Jerome told the audience, wasn't that I was treated unfairly. The scariest thing was how normal it seemed to everyone in that courtroom. The only reason anything changed was because I happened to be related to people with power. How many other people got treated the same way I did, but didn't have anyone to make phone calls for them? After his speech, a young law student approached him with a question. What do you think would have happened if your sister and brother-in-law hadn't intervened? Jerome considered the question carefully. I would have paid that $400 fine probably by skipping meals for a month. I would have lost faith in the justice system, but I would have told myself that's just how things work. And Judge Whitmore would have kept treating people badly until someone more powerful than him decided to stop it. So you think the system only works when people with power decide to use it fairly? I think the system works when people with power remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, Jerome replied. The problem is that too many people forget that lesson until someone reminds them that there might be consequences for their actions. Jerome still lived in the same small apartment and worked the same night shift at the hospital, but he'd learned something important from his experience in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for, protected, and demanded by people who cared enough to speak up when they saw it being denied to others. Sometimes that fight required powerful allies and strategic phone calls. But more often, it just required ordinary people who were willing to stand up and say that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, regardless of who they knew or where they came from. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it started with someone as simple as helping an elderly neighbor carry her groceries.